from empiricism has no metaphysics, no views about what is, as James put it, real in the completest sense of the term. Both the Will to Believe essay and the passage James cites from Loibe are quite clear that our feelings have a right, in certain cases, to dictate our beliefs. Both are equally clear that there is no residual question to be answered of the form, yes, but are those beliefs objectively true? Yet in the conclusions chapter, James takes the latter question seriously and proceeds to fudge the issue. He does so most blatantly when he says that, quote, that unshareable feeling which each one of us has of the pinch of his individual destiny may be disparaged for its egotism, may be sneered at as unscientific, but it is the one thing that fills up the measure of our concrete actuality, and any would-be existent that should lack such a feeling or its analogue would be a piece of reality only half made up. Close quote. This sentence runs together the question, what is important for a human life, with the old Platonic question, what is really real? Both Loibe and the Will to Believe essay had been careful to keep these two questions apart. The same fudging together of these two questions is found a page later when James says, quote, by being religious we establish ourselves in possession of ultimate reality at the only points at which reality is given us to guard. Our responsible concern is with our private destiny, after all. He could have said the latter, our responsible concern is with our private destiny, without saying anything about ultimate reality, but he chose to run the two assertions together. The whole point of the Will to Believe essay was to say that we don't have to settle the question of whether our beliefs correspond to reality, much less whether they put us in possession of ultimate reality, in order to have a right to beliefs that do us good. The central argument of that earlier essay was that when a live, momentous, and forced option cannot be settled by an appeal to evidence, then we have a right to let our emotions decide. There James is clear that whether to be a supernaturalist, whether to believe that we do not live on the surface of a frozen lake, because pace natural science, the best things in the universe will cast the last stone, is exactly this sort of option. But in the conclusions chapter to Varieties, he seems to be saying that this option can and should be settled by appeal to evidence, that the experiences of religious virtuosi provide evidence sufficient to make it only rational for naturalists to give up their naturalism. I doubt that he really wanted to pitch it that strong, but it's hard to construe the argument, such as it is, of the conclusions chapter in any other way. If we do so construe it, then in this chapter James betrays his own pragmatism. For pragmatists, the question of when evidence can and cannot be used to settle belief is a sociological one. A question of what counts as sufficient evidence is a matter of what counts for a certain consensus of informed inquirers at a time and place. There is no such consensus at our time and place in the case of naturalism versus supernaturalism. James can hardly claim that naturalists like Clifford were unaware of the experience of the religious virtuosi, so the most James was entitled to conclude from surveying those experiences is that he personally feels reinforced in his own attachment to supernaturalism. He is not in any position to say that Clifford has been given any reason to think again. We could, however, avoid construing the conclusions chapter in this way by saying that James is arguing not for the existence of God as something outside of the believer, but only for the existence of the believer's subconscious self. So when he says that if we disregard what he calls overbeliefs, the only, I quote him, literally and objectively true belief for which the experiences of the virtuosi give us evidence is that, quote, the conscious person is continuous with a wider self through which saving experiences come, passage I quoted before. We could take this in a sense in which that last claim would be perfectly acceptable to a doughty naturalist like Freud. For Freud's wider self is not a supernatural entity, but roughly just the part of the brain that holds the unconscious beliefs and desires that determine the pinch of our individual destinies. This construal would be supported by the fact that when James goes on to identify this wider self with the unseen or mystical world, he explicitly calls this identification his own overbelief. To be consistent with the Will to Believe essay, James would have to say that this overbelief is not the sort of thing for which there could be empirical evidence, but that he has a right to it nonetheless. I conclude that we face the following dilemma in interpreting this chapter. Either Freud and James agree on the evidential value of religious experience, or else James is betraying his own pragmatism. If we grasp the first horn, then we shall say that all that James can say in reply to Freud's Future of an Illusion is that Freud makes the same mistake as Clifford. Freud mistakenly inferred from the fact that our ancestors made many errors of fact and mixed them with their religion, that to the conclusion that we should leave off being religious at all. James puts that inference in the mouth of standard positivists like Clifford, and it's one that one could imagine Freud making. If one grants that that's a mistake, one could nonetheless go on to do what Freud did not, recognize our right to whatever religious overbeliefs the pinch of our individual destinies produce. But to grasp that horn, that is to, nudge Freud and James together in this way, will leave one wondering why we needed to have bothered with all those religious virtuosi, whether the 20 Gifford lectures add anything at all to the 20 pages of the essay of 1896 on the Will to Believe. My own view is that they don't. I think the more attractive alternative is to grasp the second horn and to say that although Varieties does indeed betray pragmatism, James was, for better or worse, more than just a pragmatist. I think, of course, that it was for the worse. This is because I don't, and here I disagree with, for example, John McDermott, Hilary Putnam, Bennett Ramsey, and David Lamberth, and many other commentators on James. Unlike them, I fail to see anything of value in either of James's later works, Radical Empiricism and A Pluralistic Universe. I read those books as unpragmatic exercises in Bergsonian metaphysics, and Bergsonian metaphysics is, in my view, the last feeble gasp of Berkeley's religiously inspired but utterly wrong-headed polemic against abstract ideas. I can, however, happily concede that, unlike those two later books, Varieties of Religious Experience should continue to be read. I suspect that it will be read with profit for centuries to come. That's not because the book provides any good arguments for any interesting conclusions. It's rather because it is a portion of the intellectual autobiography of an exceptionally magnanimous man. James's mind was more capacious and his charity more expensive than is the case with most of us. So reading his book may help us become more like James and thus help us become better people.